All right. Hello and welcome. Welcome to the first of our lecture series events here in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, the University of Macau, for this new winter semester. I will start with just one brief preliminary comment, and then I'll begin to formally introduce our visiting speaker. The preliminary is just that we will be having a very light set of refreshments downstairs at the Port Club afterwards for any of those in this room who wish to mingle. After the fact, of course, regrettably, our visitor cannot join us, but maybe that could be rectified in the future. Who knows? Maybe you'll make it out to this part of the world. We can discuss that possibility. With that said, I would like to introduce our visiting lecturer, Dr. Emma Sullivan Bissett, who is a reader in philosophy at the University of Birmingham, who conducts research on topics such as the nature of belief, its connection to truth, delusional belief, implicit bias, and other nearby phenomena. Dr. Sullivan Bissett has been the principal investigator of a couple pretty impressive research projects in recent times, one by the title Deluded by Experience, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Another titled Conspiratorial Ideation and Pathological Belief, funded by the British Academy. Dr. Sullivan Bissett has also served as the editor and author to several books. Some of the edited titles include Art and Belief with Oxford University Press, published in 2017. Another by the title Belief, Imagination, and Delusion, also with Oxford University Press just last year. The Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Delusion with Routledge 2024, and is the author of Irrationality, a forthcoming or now released book with Cambridge University
Tuesday. It comes out on Tuesday.
On Tuesday. So perfect timing. You can check that out if you're interested. Dr. Sullivan Bissett finally has published in many other prestigious venues, including journals such as Erkenntnis, the European Journal of Philosophy, Mind and Language, Philosophical Psychology, Philosophical Studies, Synthèse, and others. Today, Dr. Sullivan Bissett is presenting a talk by the title How Belief Functions. I will leave it to them to regale us with tales of how belief functions, although perhaps just before that, we could all come together in welcoming our visiting speaker.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here, and to Ben for the invitation and for hosting. So what I'm going to do today is a bit of thinking out loud, really. So I'm at the early stages of writing a book called How Belief Functions, and I'd like to put to you the main idea and kind of one application that I've been thinking about recently. So I'll dive right in. Is everything okay with the audio? You can hear me okay? Great. Awesome. Okay, so here's a roadmap. So I'll say something about belief and what I think that the belief theorists' obligations are. And then I'll give a very rough outline of my model. So my model's in kind of two parts. So I have a view about what the modal background is, which is to say what you'll find when you run into a belief across worlds, so the kind of necessary nature of belief. And I think that's quite thin and quite uninteresting. And then I'll say something about what I think belief is as it manifests in the actual world, so the kind of contingent face of belief in biological creatures like us. I'll kind of hint at how I think that can solve edge cases, so tricky cases of belief. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Neil Van Leeuwen's recent book, Religion as Make-Believe, and what he thinks religious attitudes are. I want to try and bring them back into the belief club, and I'll kind of finish with some sort of lessons about how we should think that belief overall is quite cheap, but in going cheap, we can kind of capture all the things that we want in our belief box and say some interesting things about them. Okay, so the task then. So I want to talk about belief, and right at the top, I'll say that, you know, whatever one's philosophical proclivities when it comes to the nature of belief, I take it that it's like utterly uncontroversial to the point of trite to note that, you know, what we believe and how we believe matters practically in our lives. And it's also utterly uncontroversial, I think, to begin a diagnosis of why that is so. In the following way, beliefs kind of broadly speaking play a role in our actions. right? So it matters that I believe that it's Sunday if I've got commitments on Sunday. And it matters that I believe that my library book's overdue if I want to avoid a large fine. And it matters that I believe that the bank closes at 5 p.m. if I want to make a large withdrawal today. So I think that it's fairly obvious that kind of what we believe matters to our everyday lives. And it also matters, I take it, how I come to have my beliefs. So we think, broadly speaking, that things have gone pretty well if I believe that it's Sunday and that my library book is overdue and that the bank closes at 5 p.m. by responding appropriately to the state of the world, by being epistemically diligent, and so on. And I take it that we think that things have gone less well if I believe that it's Sunday because I have a head injury, or I believe my library book's overdue because I had a dream that it was, or I believe the bank closes at 5 p.m. because I hallucinated a genie telling me so. Now, part of the book project is to say something about why we don't celebrate these methods of belief formation, but I just want to kind of note now that that's something I'm interested in, and that we do not, in fact, celebrate these forms. Now, notwithstanding those kind of broad brush, easy things to say, I think it's obvious that belief has many faces. And although its kind of mundane one is perhaps the most well-worn, a significant portion of our beliefs are not ones that matter only insofar as they help us navigate the environment. So I think some beliefs express our moral commitments or our political allegiances. Some protect us from psychological harm or help us make sense of something that would remain otherwise inexplicable. So here's a kind of bunch of beliefs that I think that a belief theorist should take within her remit, right? So my scientific belief that there is anthropogenic climate change. My belief that the Labour Party in the UK deservedly won the 2024 general election. My belief that abortion is healthcare and should be accessible. My belief that the bread offered at the Eucharist is literally the body of Christ. My belief that my partner is faithful to me, or my belief that my son has been replaced by an imposter, right? So here's a bunch of different faces of belief that I think that someone writing a book on belief needs to be interested in. So I want to give an account which kind of captures all those faces and which has belief as a really wide category. So my account's going to be super generous in what it takes to be in its remit. So my account will include beliefs about the due date of library books and the opening hours of banks, those kind of well-behaved beliefs that are well-formed and guide my action appropriately. But that's really only the beginning. So my account's also going to take under its wing my scientific belief that there's anthropogenic climate change. And like, this is a belief I have, if I'm honest, because, you know, people who seem to know about this stuff say that it's true, right? So I've done little or no investigation of the credibility of this belief myself, and which, if I'm honest, probably doesn't have the influence on my action that it probably should. But I take it that it's a belief nonetheless. My religious belief that the Eucharist, bread, is the body of Christ. My self-deceptive belief that my partner's faithful to me. And self-deceptive beliefs are, by definition, beliefs inappropriately related to evidence and driven by motivation. And maybe on the face of it, the most challenging kind of belief, my delusional belief that my son has been replaced by an imposter, and so on. So I take it our category is pretty wide, and we shouldn't shy away from that. And I think that the task of somebody given an account of belief is to do two things. So in the first case, the account should unify. So it should have the resources to accommodate kind of beliefs, various formation conditions, manifestations, and behaviours. It should capture all of those attitudes that we take to be deserving of dosastic belief status. But the account shouldn't only unify, it should also explain, right? So it should be able to answer questions like, why can't we form beliefs at will? Why does undeniable counter evidence like extinguish belief in some cases, but other cases beliefs are really recalcitrant to counter evidence? Why are some beliefs hooked up to our desires and others are not? And so on. And I think that if we're in the business of unification, if we're trying to capture what's in common between all of those kinds of beliefs that I've outlined, then we've got to be prepared to play reasonably cheap, right? So as Van Leeuwen and Lombroso have recently said, pick any property to help define belief and a motley crew of delusions, ideological beliefs, religious beliefs, and so forth. It's just going to wreak havoc on your definition. And so in pursuit of unifying our category, we've got to be in the market for a feature which captures those unremarkable garden variety attitudes about library books, but also attitudes about God and one's wayward loved ones and alien abduction and the CIA tracking me and so on. Now, faced with that huge range of beliefs, you might just be tempted to say, actually, that's not a task we can discharge. And maybe we should instead think that the way in which we're using the word belief, it just means lots of different things. So Van Leeuwen and Lombroso, again, have recently said that, look, we should move away from the idea that belief is one thing, and we should instead be open to our pre-theoretical use of the term belief actually capturing processing involving distinct cognitive attitudes. So they say that it's a mistake to expect that there's a single psychological kind which is responsible for all instances of believing, right? So we should stop looking for a unifying property that will capture all the things that we think are beliefs. And they say that once we give up on that unification project, which is doomed, then we get to characterize varieties of believing, which are different kinds of attitudes, much more robustly, and we get to add features as we please, which will be explanatory of those various different kinds which we've allowed ourselves to distinguish. So I want to resist a picture like this. I don't want to give up on unification. And I think we can have unification without explanatory loss. So what I want to say in the book is that we can characterize beliefs as having various kind of biological etiologies, and that's going to allow for greater explanatory power. So my view is going to capture beliefs as produced in the service of different biological functions. However, we needn't give up on unification. What I instead want to advocate for is opting for what I'm labeling ontic austerity, so kind of a very thin conception of what belief is across possible worlds. And that's going to allow us to capture what unites all of belief's instances in this world, but also in other possible worlds. So the overall picture says that we should leave the kind of messy business of everyday variation and all the strange cases that I've indicated, leave all of that to be picked up by the kind of diversity of contingent ways in which belief manifests in the actual world. So we can attend to the contingent biological circumstances in which beliefs are formed. But what is really key to my view is that we resist taking any of those features to be kind of necessary ones, to be ones that we can spread out across possible worlds. So I want to say that we can find explanations for beliefs' behavior in its manifestation in the actual world set against a background motivational account. So overall, when answering the question, what is belief? I think that the philosophical goal of unifying the category and our goals of explaining all its individual instances, they're not going to arise from the same theoretical resources, but can nonetheless be served by one overall approach. So if that's not yet clear, I'm going to say more now about the two components of my account, and hopefully that will become clearer. Okay, so first the unification project. So what is belief? And I talk here about the modal background, which is just to say that what is belief across any possible world? And I should also say that although providing unification, I think that answering this modal question is actually less interesting, at least for the kind of project that I'm interested in. And it's going to be less explanatorily fruitful, but it kind of sits in the background of my account. So on my view, belief is an attitude with a particular motivational role. And this is how kind of uncommitted I am to really being precise about this. I've said for years, actually, this one will do for my purposes. I think this kind of broadly captures it. And this comes from Lucy O'Brien. So I think that belief is an attitude which by itself and relative to one's background desires disposes the subject to behave in ways which would fulfill her desires if the contents of the belief were true across contexts. The across context is my addition there for reasons that will become clear later. But the basic picture is, like, if you're wondering what you'll run into when you find a belief in a possible world or in this world, what you'll find is a state which is motivational. So if you want to capture belief across worlds, I think that action is where the action is. And I don't want to say much about belief's motivational role, because as I say, I don't really think that's where the interest in explanatory gains lie, but I'll just speak briefly to the idea that it's shared by other mental states, and so it can't be distinctive of belief. And I think this point was most famously put by David Velleman with his elephant. So he thinks that characterizing belief as a state which motivates action won't distinguish it from, for example, imagination. So when a child imagines that she is an elephant, Velleman says, she'll be disposed to act in ways such that, if the content of the imagining were true, it would promote the satisfaction of her desires. And so it looks like the state of imagination will equally meet any description of belief by appeal to motivational role alone. And if that's right, then our modal condition that I want to sit in the background of my view is not going to distinguish belief from other mental states after all. So just to say that I think that this objection has been comprehensively answered. I think that the role that imagination plays is context dependent. So that's part of what the across context edition is doing. So the roles played by imagination and belief, it's said, and I think correctly, are going to come apart in some contexts. And once we enumerate those contexts, then we'll be able to see that belief is distinct from imagination. Just to say that there's a recent challenge to this kind of view from Anna Aquino that's just come out in the last few weeks. I'm just flagging that. That's something with which I know I need to engage, and which if you are kind of interested and compelled by this kind of view, then I recommend looking at that paper. But the final thing to say about the motivational role is that, like, if you're thinking about other kind of objections or counter examples, I guess I think I'm not kind of sparring partner that you're looking for. So I'm not going to spend time trying to precisify the exact motivational role of belief, or even further defending the one given, because what I want to say is that however it's captured, that's it. There's nothing more to say about the necessary nature of belief. So any ideas you might have about belief being kind of necessarily connected to truth or evidence or rationality, all of that's gone on my view. All I think belief is the kind of state that makes you do stuff in concert with desires across context. So that's kind of how I'm answering the modal question in a kind of ontically austere way. So that kind of sits in the background of my account. The contingencies of belief, I think, are more interesting and allow us kind of more explanatory value. So my overall program is one which says we should pay attention to the biological circumstances in which beliefs are formed in creatures like us, right? But which resists any ontological reading of beliefs features which arise from those circumstances, right? So I think it would be a mistake to project the particular circumstances of our biological heritage into a modal claim about what belief must be in any kind of creature. So I think that it's belief's particular manifestation in the actual world set against a background of belief as essentially motivational, where we can find explanations for various ways that belief and belief formation work, both in central cases and also at the edges. So I'm going to be interested in attributing functions to mechanisms of belief formation. So I'll just say something about how I'm understanding mechanisms of belief formation. And here I think that McKay and Dennett have a really useful characterization in their landmark paper. So I'm going to be understanding it roughly like this: an information processing system that takes certain inputs, so perceptual inputs, and via manipulation of these inputs produces certain outputs. And I guess certain inputs means perceptual inputs, one's background beliefs, testimony, other sources of information or evidence processed in the formation of belief. And via manipulation of these inputs is going to capture the various ways we form beliefs, right? Via a process of mere endorsement of what's perceived, or deliberation of evidence, and indeed the working of various cognitive and motivational biases. And I think that mechanisms of belief formation are prime candidates for a kind of biological function story, given that beliefs produce changes to the way we navigate within and respond to our environment. And so the mechanisms which produce them are exactly the kinds of things for which adaptive pressures are going to be in play. That's what I want to say. So I want to start with a claim that's reasonably uncontroversial, which is that a lot of the time beliefs are adaptive when they're true, right? It's really useful for us to have true beliefs about where we can, find food and shelter and so on. And once we recognize that true beliefs are adaptive beliefs, then we're in a position to ascribe a proper function to the mechanisms which produce them. And I think we're in the territory of kind of well-worn claims in suggesting that mechanisms of belief formation have the function of producing true beliefs. So I've said this, but people have said this long before I was even born, in fact. So this is a kind of long-standing claim that I'm not claiming is particularly original, but I do think it's true, and I do think it's a useful claim. And just to flag that I'm understanding functions here historically, so as picking out something performed by a trait's ancestors which helped account for its existence. So we say that, for example, that the modern day human heart has the function of pumping blood because ancestral tokens of the heart pump blood, and that got them selected. So I do kind of historical functions which talk about which things, what things did which got them selected in the relevant evolutionary history. And I think that our mechanisms of belief formation, such as they're set up, have proliferated because, given the essential nature of belief, that is, its motivational role, which I loosely specified, creatures with true beliefs enjoyed biological advantages which increased inclusive fitness. They were more likely to survive because their actions were successful when their beliefs were true. So, as much as I say that the modal character of belief is not that interesting, it does do some explanatory lifting here, because it gives us an explanation for why, in the actual world, mechanisms directed at truth are biologically adaptive, because in the actual world, true beliefs are those which tend to facilitate successful action. But I also think that it's fairly obvious that true belief production is not the only thing at which our mechanisms for belief production are aimed, right? There's lots of cases, it seems to me, of false belief which seem to have been produced by mechanisms like doing what they're supposed to do rather than making a mistake, right? So producing adaptive beliefs which are usually false. And if there are such cases, then I think that we have got good reason to specify broadly a second function proper to those mechanisms so that we can account for the etiology of these cases. And again, I'm not doing anything particularly novel here. Lots of people have said something along these lines, but I think that it's useful to have a kind of second broad function in our background, which is something like the production of useful beliefs, where usefulness is not understood as relating to approximating to truth, but rather useful in facilitating self-organization, maintaining self-esteem, avoiding psychological damage, and so on. Now, you might think that, sure, we've got lots of false beliefs, and sure, sometimes it's quite useful to have a false belief, but maybe they're best conceived of as resulting from mechanisms aiming at truth and missing, right? In which case these false beliefs arise from a function failing to be performed. And sure, they're accidentally useful, but they it wasn't part of the game plan to produce beliefs of this kind. I think that we shouldn't say that. I think there are good reasons to think that this isn't the right way to approach cases where actually it looks quite useful to have a false belief. A really commonly cited claim comes from Taylor and Brown in their landmark paper in '94, when they talk about unrealistic optimism. And they talk about unrealistic beliefs about oneself leading to engagement in adaptive behaviours. And they say that, in fact, optimal mental health is associated with unrealistic positive self-appraisals and beliefs. More recently, Kate Nolfi, who also develops a biological function approach, she says that research supplies compelling evidence that we are, as a general rule, more successful in achieving our various ends when our beliefs about ourselves and our relationship to the world around us are systematically distorted in particular ways. And finally, some people have also said that particular kinds of beliefs, like our moral beliefs, are adaptive insofar as they facilitate cooperation and social cohesion, but not insofar as they're true. And some folk have said this kind of thing about beliefs about epistemic normativity. So, they're adaptive, not because they're true, because they make us better at responding to epistemic considerations. So all of these cases are ones where I take it that the cognitive mechanisms responsible are not responding to truth, but they are, according to some folk at least, nonetheless producing adaptive beliefs. for my money, it would be surprising if all of these cases were ones which were properly conceptualized as ones where things had gone wrong, especially how widespread a lot of these kinds of beliefs are and how they look to contribute positively to fitness. So I think that the existence of these beliefs might look to be in virtue of design, not mistake. So I now just want to give an interim conclusion. So taking stock of where we are so far. So I think that the category of belief is unified by its essential nature, captured by its motivational role. And that's quite kind of thin and slightly uninteresting, but that's what belief is across worlds. No one said it had to be exciting. But then things get much more interesting. So then we get to look at belief as it manifests in the actual world. And then we get to add to our picture some claims about the contingent ways in which beliefs are realized, right? In particular, a picture which understands beliefs as produced by mechanisms with the proper function of producing true beliefs. And in light of the fact that it looks like that's not always what our mechanisms of belief formation are up to, we might also specify a second proper function, the production of useful beliefs. Now, I'm not really going to say much more about my function claims. I just wanted you to have the bones of the whole account available as we go forward. And indeed, when thinking about how our goals of unifying the category of belief and giving explanations of various kinds of beliefs might be best served. So I think that these are different projects and they're best served by different theoretical resources. Actually, the kind of extant accounts that I disagree with that I want to discuss in my future work, they actually take these two philosophical goals to be served by the same resources, to be served by claims like belief is necessarily aimed at truth or belief is constitutively normative. I just want to say that actually you can't do both of these things when you stick to the same set of theoretical resources. We need to kind of split these things up. There's a question about what belief is at base, and that's actually quite thin and uninteresting. And then there's a question about the kind of richness and heterogeneity of belief as it manifests in our world. Okay. So I'll say something now about edge cases and non-dosasticism. Non-dosasticism being the view of a particular attitude that is not a belief. So I use the term edge cases to capture those beliefs which are a bit tricky. So those beliefs which aren't kind of boring beliefs about library books or bank opening hours. So beliefs which look to behave a bit differently from more kind of garden variety standard beliefs. And here are some examples, some of which I mentioned earlier. So religious beliefs, self-deceptive beliefs, and delusional beliefs. And these are the three that I'm really interested in exploring in the book and seeing if my account can, on the one hand, capture them as beliefs, which I think is the right thing to do, and on the other hand, explain why they look a bit different. And I'll say something general about this approach now before looking at just one kind of case, which is religious belief, and trying to bring religious attitudes back into the belief club, well, because they've recently been cast out, and I think that's a mistake. So I think the commonality among edge cases is that the attitudes produced by the mechanisms responsible are often false, and they don't look belief-like in various ways. And I think that non-dosasticism, so the view that these things aren't beliefs after all, I think that's largely motivated by a characterization of belief which is simply too strict, which ties it closely to truth and evidence and rationality, right? So people say things like, beliefs must be aimed at truth, beliefs must be evidence responsive, beliefs must form a coherent set. And these claims, at least in some parts of the literature, are all but taken as truisms, right? As datums to which our belief accounts should be sensitive. And when cases of ostensible beliefs fail to measure up to these very strict conceptions, then we get non-dosasticism entering the picture. And just to kind of support that claim of what the literature looks like, all of these non-dosastic views are motivated in this way. So religious attitudes, which I'll talk about shortly, Neil Van Leeuwen in his book, and more recently Anna Aquino in a paper, they think that religious attitudes are not beliefs, in part because they have this dodgy, as they put it, relationship with evidence. Self-deceptive beliefs, again, Robert Aldi says that these aren't beliefs, that they don't behave in the way that we might expect of beliefs with respect to their relationship to evidence. And delusional beliefs, which is maybe the trickier case. Greg Curry, Richard Dubb have argued that delusional beliefs, insofar as they don't respond to evidence in the ways that we ought to expect, aren't beliefs after all. So I want to reject these kind of strong claims, at least in their modal reading, right? So I think we should release the essential nature of belief from the shackles of this kind of strict, unmoving conception. And then that allows us to be much more nuanced about the kinds of beliefs that we see manifesting in the actual world. That being said, I do think that many beliefs, or even most beliefs, have the features that these strong characterizations demand, right? So I'm not kind of saying that we're all kind of profoundly irrational and none of our beliefs are evidence responsive. I'm not saying anything like that, right? Most of our beliefs do kind of update reliably, are responsive to our epistemic environments in the appropriate ways and so on. But I also think that some don't, and that we shouldn't think that that disqualifies them from being beliefs. And that's because being a belief comes pretty cheaply, right? But we can nevertheless appeal to the contingent circumstances of beliefs manifestation in the actual world to see why most beliefs meet the strict conception. I think most beliefs are produced by mechanisms seeking to produce true beliefs for obvious reasons, because it's really adaptive to have true beliefs. But I also think that there are certain circumstances, certain contingent conditions in which the mechanisms are doing something different, right? And that's where we can start to tell stories about some of the edge cases. So I think we can get the explanatory wins of capturing the well-behaved beliefs and the conditions under which they're formed without giving up dosasticism about those edge cases. And my overall position is belief is nice and cheap. Belief attribution should be really, really tolerant. And with the theoretical resources of my approach, we get to explain the huge range of beliefs proper without giving up on dosasticism or positing in-between states like people like Eric Schwitzgebel and Andy Egan have done. Nevertheless, even if I'm quite thin about what I think belief is, that's not to say that there's no threat from non-dosasticism, right? Because I do say that belief is something, it has some condition. And so when you see some candidate attitudes which fail that condition, then of course non-dosasticism is kind of back on the table. And often non-dosasticists will motivate their position by saying that the target attitude doesn't play the motivational role of belief. And that's something that I need to care about, because that's something which I don't think we can negotiate on. So even my view, which says belief is really cheap, it's got some work to do in keeping some of these attitudes in the belief club when they don't look hooked up to action in the manner of belief. And that's what I want to do in the book. Okay, so that's the kind of background picture, my overall position. I hope that's reasonably clear. I now want to show it in action, and I want to talk about religious attitudes. And in particular, I'm going to focus on Neil Van Leeuwen's recently published book, Religion as Make-Believe. And he argues that religious attitudes are not beliefs. He uses the term factual beliefs, I'll come to that, but are a different kind of cognitive attitude. I think my account shows that belief as a category is pretty tolerant of the kinds of differences which motivates his position. So belief is cheap. It's an attitude which guides our actions across contexts, all else being equal. I think religious attitudes do that. And so they're beliefs. End of that particular story. And then we get to tell a kind of story about why it is that they look a bit different from beliefs about kind of library books and bank times. Now, Van Leeuwen has a very thick conception indeed of what beliefs are, and he uses the term factual belief to really capture this. So Van Leeuwen's factual beliefs are made up of attitudes with the following features. So they're involuntary, they happen to us, rather than arise from any intention to believe their contents. So we can kind of voluntarily imagine certain things or suppose certain things. But most people think that we can't voluntarily bring about beliefs. No compartmentalization, so they guide action across contexts, and there's the bit on which we agree. And then he has these additional considerations. So he thinks that beliefs govern inferential transitions. I'm not going to say anything more about that. And that beliefs are kind of hostage to the evidence. They're quickly formed in response to evidence. They're quickly extinguished in response to sufficient counter evidence, and so on. Now, our beliefs about library books and bank opening times are kind of obvious candidates. They're going to meet all of these conditions. But I don't think that an attitude's failing to meet all of these conditions is going to give us good enough reason to shunt it out of the belief club. So Van Leeuwen's factual beliefs is a term of art which does the work of picking out mental states with a certain bundle of features, those 4 features that I just outlined. And I think it's really helpful to have this term factual belief, because I think it's useful to have a category where kind of the boring stuff goes, right? Beliefs that are involuntary, that motivate action consistently, that cognitively govern consistently, that are easily updated. And here's something on which I agree with Van Leeuwen. I think religious attitudes are not factual beliefs, right? I don't think that they have all of those features. He's quite right about that and makes a really compelling case. Where we disagree is whether factual belief, in capturing beliefs with that collection of features, is marking a line in the doxastic sand, which is to say whether it is marking where belief simpliciter begins and ends. So Van Leeuwen says that those 4 features define the space of cognitive attitudes and mark a greater divide in that space. I think that that is to assign such beliefs, those beliefs with those features, too much metaphysical clout. I don't think that we need to be drawing the line around those features. So I have no idea whether this works. This is my first time using this example, but consider things in the following way and feel free to tell me that this isn't a good way of going. But so we might all agree that beliefs about botany can be marked out as a kind of belief based on their contents all being botany related, or beliefs about my grandmother's passing are a kind of belief based upon all of them giving rise to a particular emotional response. And examples of this kind of thing can be multiplied indefinitely. But I take it that we trade in kind talk here pretty loosely, right? No one's going to make metaphysical hay out of these categorizations that I've just made up, even if it turned out that all beliefs about botany or all beliefs about my grandmother's passing did in fact reside together with respect to their exemplification of certain kinds of features. And of course, I think Van Leeuwen's factual belief category makes a far greater claim to metaphysical heft, right? And is much more kind of important and theoretically interesting than these examples. So I don't want to downplay the theoretical substance of the category as he defines it. But I nevertheless think that factual beliefs might be a bit like beliefs about botany and beliefs about my grandmother's passing, right? They resemble each other with respect to some features, but we might be better carving the beginning and end of belief before we get to those kinds of details. And indeed, I think there are good reasons to carve those joints, so the beginning and the end of belief, in a much more tolerant and broad way. And if that's right, then Van Leeuwen's category of factual beliefs captures, I think, a significant subset, but not the limit of belief simpliciter. And that means that we can identify what hangs on our disagreement in the following way, right? So you might think, like, I agree with Van Leeuwen that religious attitudes are often different from attitudes about library books, for example, right? And you might already think, so isn't that already a substantive point? Does it matter whether we then count religious attitudes as beliefs, because beliefs are super cheap, or whether we count them as secondary cognitive attitudes, as Van Leeuwen wants to, because belief is a bit more expensive and has all of these other features? But I think that it really matters for our overall metaphysics of belief where we take the category to begin and end. And so here we can identify the disagreement by appeal to the first of his 2 main theses in the book, which is the distinct attitude thesis. So he says that factual belief and religious credence both exist and are distinct cognitive attitudes, which is to say they're 2 different ways of processing ideas. So I want to make a case for a doxastic ontology which carves things differently. And that's because I think a whole host of beliefs fail to meet the conditions which characterize Van Leeuwen's factual belief, but there's nonetheless something interesting about all of them and factual beliefs which unites them, which is their motivational role. And so at least in this respect, we've got ourselves a unified category and a single kind of attitude. And of course, there are other respects in which the attitudes in that group are going to differ, But I want to say that these respects are going to map kind of different positions in the broader property space in which belief lives, rather than marking a particularly salient divide or a different way of processing ideas. And the differences are observed can be traced to the contingent biological circumstances in which beliefs arise in the actual world. Now, earlier I said that what I think belief is across worlds is an attitude which plays a particular motivational role. And I said, like, this will do. This one will do for our purposes. I'm not really interested in kind of being more precise. It's an attitude which, you know, disposes you to behave in ways which would fulfill your desires if the contents of the belief were true across contexts. And for our purposes, I think we can understand Van Leeuwen's second condition on factual beliefs in roughly this way, right? So he also thinks that beliefs are necessarily motivational. But it's really important to note that any feature like this is going to have an all else equal clause within it, right? So my belief that I should respond to my child when he cries might be relevant in the setting of his being in his cot at night, right? But my failure to respond because I'm asleep or because I'm restrained doesn't put any pressure on the claim that I nevertheless have the belief, right? Now, that's a really easy case, and others are going to be much harder, as we'll see in a minute. But I just want to note kind of at the top that an attitude not fulfilling the role which delineates belief needn't lose its spot at the belief club if all else is not equal. And whatever you make of the motivational role as I've given it, what matters for what follows is whether religious attitudes are properly characterized as playing that role or not, or indeed whether they can be excused for not doing so on the grounds that all else is not equal. So what I'm going to say now, what I want to show is that religious attitudes do play the motivational role of belief, and that where they don't look to play that role, the all else equal clause gets them off the hook. So there are some beliefs, I think, for which all else is always equal and excuse is never to be made, and we might call those factual beliefs. But provisions should be made for those which need excusing sometimes, and those provisions, I think, will be enough to keep religious attitudes in the same club as factual beliefs along this dimension. And I do think that when it comes to at least a superficial glance at the behaviour of religious attitudes, there are cases, some cases, where things do look a bit different from factual beliefs with respect to alignment with action. But I do think that that surface difference is explicable by appeal to the particular circumstances of manifestation rather than indicative of religious attitudes failing to be appropriately hooked up to action in the manner of belief. So what I'll do now in the last part is speak to Van Leeuwen's defense of the claim that religious attitudes do not play the motivational role of belief. And most of his observations are made of the Vineyard movement, which is rooted in evangelical Christianity, but he does think that his overall approach is generalizable. But I will be talking about cases of Christians. So here's the first observation. And he's, so common is this kind of phenomenon that we have a term for it, once a week Christians, that you might be familiar with. So Van Leeuwen points out that modern Christians will claim that they behave as if God doesn't exist when it's not Sunday or other sacred times. And this is so common that we have this term for it, that people may self-identify as once a week Christians. And just to give some examples, so a smaller proportion of subscriptions to pornography begin on Sundays, even though the overall rates are roughly the same in religious and non-religious communities, whilst responses to charitable appeals are higher in religious folk on Sunday. So it does look like religiously motivated behaviour or refraining from particular behaviours is context dependent in a way that we might not expect of belief. And many folk also claim that they wish they could more consistently regulate their behaviour in line with God's expectations or desires. And Van Leeuwen draws from this that, given that these people wish they could regulate their behaviour, then doing so is contrary to how things usually are, right? Most of the week, you don't act as if God is there. And related to the once a week Christian phenomenon is a further observation about other behaviours which only occur in particular settings. So this is John Bielecki's discussion of demonic attacks, He said, "I never heard of anyone who claimed to have encountered a full demonic manifestation in the wild, so outside a charismatic service or a collective session of charismatic prayer." And Van Leeuwen says of this, not only do people fail to behave as though God exists outside sacred times and places, they also don't behave as though demons exist outside of religious settings. And this is especially notable because people who profess to believe in demons should take them to be more likely to be present, like inside the supermarket and outside of the sacred settings, because demons are weakened by the presence of God. So Van Leeuwen says, why, if demons are afraid of God, do their manifestations only show up in settings where God is supposed to be maximally present? So what I want to say about these kinds of cases is that I think that some beliefs are more salient than others in certain contexts. And Anna Aquino has pressed this into an observation that no belief has its motivational power across contexts. I think that that is stretching the point too far, as I'll note, but Aquino argues that her belief that white wine gives me migraine is relevant in the context of ordering drinks, and yet when her desire to try the Prosecco is sufficiently strong, it fails to guide her action. Now, I think she's quite right in this case, and when the dictates of belief conflict with our desires, their motivating power may well be weakened. But I also think that there are surely some beliefs which never lose their motivational power. So like my belief in gravity never falters. So I never let my desire for unassisted flight or my cognitive laziness or my fatigue push the motivating power of that belief into the background of my agency. So I think perhaps beliefs which kind of straightforwardly meet the motivational role condition might make up a smaller club than we might have thought, but I don't think their membership, as Aquino does, is zero. But when a belief does fail to have its motivating power across the piece, we must check whether things are not equal, because if they're not equal, then the differences observed might be traceable to contingencies of the context rather than marking a kind of line in the sand. And I think that someone's desire for ungodly things, so things that one wouldn't do under God's eye, does make things not equal with respect to belief's motivating power, right? So one's desires may well become, as Aquino puts it, phenomenologically predominant when one is away from a godly setting. And I think that this is a kind of familiar fact about how belief behaves, right? So I desire chocolate cake on a Thursday. That overwhelms my belief that that's against the rules of my Monday very virtuous vegan group, or Aquino's desire for Prosecco overwhelms her belief that white wine gives her migraine, and so on. So when belief isn't convenient, then it can fade into the background with respect to motivational power. But I take it that that gives us a case of all else not being equal. And I think we can say similar things about belief in demons. So if you believe in the possibility of demonic manifestation, I think that that might not be at the forefront of your mind when selecting avocados or walking the dog or cleaning the oven, right? It might even be like positively inconvenient to attend to that belief with its associated behavioral manifestations in everyday life. But I don't think that we then should say that attitudes regarding demons are secondary, or that they have their motivating power constrained by some more primary belief, which is what Van Leeuwen wants to say. It's rather just to say that all else isn't equal and the manifestation of the motivational power of belief is subject to contingencies. The second observation that Van Leeuwen brings to the idea that religious attitudes don't motivate action in the manner of belief is that church services are about reminding people to take God seriously and to behave in ways that will enable God to have an impact on their lives. So various rituals are designed to strengthen religious attitudes. And Van Leeuwen says that such deliberate strengthening would make little sense if religious beliefs were straightforward factual beliefs, right? So you never need to kind of strengthen your attitude that the bank's going to shut at 5 o'clock or strengthen your attitude that the library's open, right? That doesn't really make any sense. And of course that's right, but I don't think we should generate that into a claim about these attitudes not being beliefs at all, right? Especially if all else is not equal. And I think that the strengthening of attitudes goes on in many domains without the fear that the attitude being targeted is not a belief, right? So the philosopher with tendencies towards imposter syndrome. So she might find it helpful to attend to her positive referee reports and student feedback in an effort to strengthen her somewhat fragile belief in her abilities. Or the British Labour Party member at risk of political inactivity between general elections might find it helpful to kind of participate in local activism to solidify his political beliefs and the importance of remaining engaged. Now, of course, Van Leeuwen could simply deny that these are cases of belief after all, on the grounds that they need strengthening in this way. But I think that to cast these kinds of attitudes out of the club is to require too much of belief and to lose recognition of a group of attitudes which are unified by their motivational role when circumstances are otherwise equal. So instead, I think that we should say of these and religious attitudes that they might be a bit flaky, they might need a bit of assistance to stick around, but they're beliefs nonetheless. That's not to say that, we have to deny that some beliefs don't need this kind of strengthening, right? So beliefs about library books might be kind of robust enough to withstand the contingencies of motivation or circumstance, but I don't see why we should draw a metaphysical line around that observation. Okay, the final observation comes from how petitionary prayer works. So petitionary prayer is a type of prayer where a subject asks God for something. So it's distinct from prayers of worship or gratitude. And the first point Van Leeuwen makes about this is about the kinds of things that people pray for. So he says that people don't ask God to bring about events that, from a naturalistic standpoint, are impossible. So people may pray for God to help them find a competent, reasonably priced mechanic who can fix their car, but they don't pray to God to make a working carburettor appear ex nihilo, out of nowhere. And Van Leeuwen draws on Justin Barrett's research on petitionary prayer, which shows that folks are more likely to pray for God to intervene in such a way that he affects psychological or biological change rather than observable mechanical ones. So one might pray to God for him to change someone's mind about where to steer a boat rather than to plug a hole in a boat that's leaking. So the things prayed for are things that Van Leeuwen says are kind of left open as possibilities by one's real beliefs. But it seems to me that we might equally think that, So we might think that if you truly believe in God, then the kinds of things that you pray for ought to follow from the beliefs that you have about God, right? So if you believe in the existence of an omnipotent God, then the request to kind of fix a hole in a leaky boat is like quite a minor request. It's quite a minor imposition on God's power. And so if you really believe in a God of this kind, why doesn't that belief show up as we might expect in the act of petitionary prayer? That's the challenge. I actually think that a bit of reflection shows that not only can the contents of prayers be excused as not aligning with the contents of some religious attitudes, but that is in fact a predictable result of religious life. And that's because experience may well have taught you, or, this might have been passed down the generations that, God's a bit fussy about what he answers prayers for, right? He doesn't perform miracles or even particular kinds of act like boat restoration. And you might imagine theodicies in place to explain this rather restricted intervention. Indeed, there are theodicies in place in the philosophy of religion about the kinds of things that you ought to pray for. Now, Van Leeuwen characterizes this as folk kind of praying for God to make things break their way when things are uncertain, with uncertainty understood as that left open by your actual beliefs. But it seems to me that we could equally just say that one's religious attitudes are responding to experience, and that gives a sense of the limits of what God will do in response to prayer. Another observation about prayer is that folk will still work towards that which is prayed for. So Van Leeuwen says that they may pray to God for relief from a medical problem, but they'll still see the doctor and get second opinions and take prescribed medication and do the usual requisite non-religious activities. So Van Leeuwen says of this that it's clear that people are still retaining a picture of how the world works, and that picture is actually what's guiding their actions. But I think that this pattern of behaviour can also be explained in a similar way to our explanation of the contents of prayer. Right? Religious folk who pray may have learned that God is just pretty unreliable when it comes to the business of answering prayer. And that's not like shade on God, right? I'm sure they would also think that there's perfectly good reasons for that unreliability. And indeed, there's a huge literature on the point of petitionary prayer. And if that is at all tracking the realities of the role of prayer in religious life, then it seems to me that it's unsurprising that folk don't want to rely on prayer for their medical needs. And so we might say instead that background beliefs about the effectiveness of prayer is such that it's sensible to hedge one's bets. Okay, I want to take 5 more minutes to just kind of say why we should think belief is cheap and why that's the right way to go. So I've made a lot of excuses for religious attitudes, and I will probably make a lot of excuses for self-deception and delusion in my other work. So I'm in the game of excuses. So I've said things like, well, once a week Christians have religious attitudes which aren't salient in particular contexts, and sure, religious attitudes are a bit flaky sometimes, and people engage in prayer but only in a half-hearted way because they've got these other beliefs about how God behaves and so on. And so you might just be thinking, like, sure, you get to keep religious attitudes in the belief club, but only by bending the relevant condition for membership so far out of shape, right? Or stretching that all else equal clause to beyond what is reasonable. And you might just say, come on, isn't it just more plausible that beliefs are just different in this respect from more everyday beliefs about library books, right? You might think that the motivational condition which is sitting in the background is just so cheap and so defeasible that it's just uninteresting and uninformative. And to this, I want to say the following, right? We should want a wider unification than Van Leeuwen's approach and others like it, which build all these extra conditions, can offer, because I don't think we should fracture the dosastic space into many pieces and pay insufficient heed to the feature which keeps them all in the same club. But of course, that feature can't be too demanding, right? So of course, identifying what unites all the attitudes which are beliefs requires that we should play cheap. But here's something that I want to be really unapologetic about, right? I don't think we should see going cheap as a theoretical burden out of which we must kind of seek to make the best in a slightly embarrassed way. I think that if we look around, we see that human belief formation and maintenance is like vulnerable to complex and changing internal and external elements, giving rise to a set of attitudes with like various features. This is predictable. And I think it's unsurprising that we have to squint to see what's left that might unify them. And no belief is formed in a vacuum. We live very complex psychological, social lives, right? All are subject to the changing winds of our motivations or the turning tides of epistemic luck and a host of other contingencies which are going to complicate the relationships between belief and evidence and belief and governance and belief and action and so on. So I think when philosophers construct accounts of belief which focus on the kind of epistemic do-gooders, the well-behaved beliefs, they just end up being too strict. And then we get this non-dosasticism threatening for the cases which aren't perfectly well-behaved. But I just think that our account of belief should be more tuned in to the wide-ranging heterogeneity exhibited by belief, lest we idolize at the expense of unification and explanation. And I began by saying that, sure, in seeking a unifying property, we've got to be cheap, because if we're any stricter, then we're going to have a sparsely populated category, and we're going to exclude the kinds of cases that we've talked about today. But what I want to do in the book is say that my view is able to bring these cases back from the edge, right? They're straightforwardly tokens of belief, just like any other, insofar as they meet the motivational condition. And then we can start to look at the kind of biology to understand why they behave in particular kinds of ways. So I'll just, one more slide, I'll say 3 final quick things about the virtues of my account, which takes belief to be kind of cheap, with the additional characteristics as explainable by appeal to its contingent manifestation in biological creatures. So the first is the obvious one, which is unification. I think my view allows us to capture beliefs in a single category by appeal to a single modal condition. And that allows us to capture the boring cases as well as the more interesting cases. But I also think, although I haven't argued this today, but I also think my picture allows us to explain belief's relationship to truth as secured by the contingent biological circumstances of some beliefs, but it's also going to be consistent with, and hopefully insightful to, various things that we might say about the stranger cases of religious belief, self-deceptive belief, delusional belief, and so on. And finally, and this moves people in different ways, it moves me quite a lot, parsimony. I think that it's better if we don't have to revise our folk psychological understanding of cognition or its components, right? So to accommodate edge cases, some philosophers have proposed whole new categories, right? Andy Egan has proposed bioimagination to accommodate delusion. Tamar Gendler has proposed a-leaf to accommodate self-deception. Van Leeuwen has proposed religious credence to accommodate religious attitudes. And I think that these authors are forced to such moves because they work with an intolerant conception of belief, which is ill-equipped to accommodate the quirks of some of its tokens. And I think that in that respect, my view does better, right? We can capture all of these cases as beliefs, and then we can start to tell stories about why they look to behave a little bit differently. Okay, so to conclude, the account outlined here, I want to say, opens avenues for a better understanding of beliefs' various guises, right? From garden variety beliefs about library books to beliefs embedding strange metaphysical commitments, right through to the beliefs that might be under the spell of our desires. And I think its attention to the modally local question, right, concerning belief in the actual world and its biological history, which actually is what's going to illuminate various phenomena associated with belief. But we shouldn't bulk up the modal character of belief to include various epistemic notions, because that's just going to kind of make our box of beliefs really, really sparse. And it's also going to close off various explanatory gains, I think. So I think we can enjoy the cake of unification whilst eating the cake of explanation with a bonus sprinkling of parsimony. And my overall message is, let's be really ontically austere, take belief to be cheap, and instead focus our energies on how belief functions in the actual world in biological creatures like us. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Immaculately timed as well. I'm going to do as I usually do and begin
Establishing a cue. Okay, to start us off, Nevia, why don't you begin? And if you could, yeah, please hit that button there. Yeah. That same goes for anybody who asks a question later on. Please do.
Emma, thank you very much for this great talk. Super interesting. And I'm glad that you can actually share your work in the context of the lecture series. We would have loved to have you here in Macau for the conference, but maybe in the future. Yeah. So I have many questions, but I just select a couple of them. The first is, so I have the impression that maybe beliefs are even cheaper. I completely share your anti-non-doxasticism for many of your same reasons. But the one thing that is, to me, maybe hampering the project of unification is this idea that beliefs at their core have a motivational role. Because in fact, I think we should also accept into this category of beliefs, perhaps cheaper category, those beliefs that are not conducive to action, that seem to have actually no causal relation to action. And not just, I'm not just thinking of acrasia, but I mean, there are many instances, right, in which subjects actually hold beliefs actually or dispositionally, but these are not related to consequent actions. So this is the first worry I have with respect to your identification of the core of the concept of belief in his motivational role. And the second is a curiosity that I have. It was not actually the focus of your presentation today, but thinking of the role of the belief formation and the functional role of belief in our biological history. You mentioned the idea that beliefs, even if they are not false, they may be useful. Yeah. Right. If they are not true, they may be false and useful. This probably relates to the phenomenon of self-deception, among others. Who knows, maybe also religious beliefs, I don't know. But in fact, there are cases in which beliefs may be not just false, but also harmful, so they are not functional. They are like disadaptive, maladaptive. So I wonder whether you have a view on that. What can we do with this kind of? Do we still want to accept them into the category of beliefs?
Right. Let me just write it down. Thank you so much. I thought I was the cheapest one could be, so it's nice to know that someone takes herself to be even cheaper. That's good. That makes me feel less controversial. So I guess I'd really be interested in hearing some examples, because when I hear of cases where there's no causal relation to action, what I'm inclined to think is this is where we pull the all else equal thing, right? And we just say that they're not in the relevant conditions for that action, for that belief to be hooked up to action in the relevant way. So I guess what kind of things were you thinking about when you said there are some beliefs which are just not related to action at all?
Well, I'm thinking of various cases here. So, for example, I might have the belief that it is not convenient for me to have a dog, because I have so many reasons for forming that belief. I do not have time to take him out, to take the dog out. I do not have enough space in my flat, so far and so forth. But at the same time, I can be overwhelmed by emotions. When I find a little puppy in the street, this is not revising this is not helpful in belief revision. I may still think, oh, this is really the worst decision I could have ever made to bring the puppy home. I still believe that is a very bad idea. So this is also related to the core motivational role that you had. I mean, I tend to think of a motivational role as a more related to affective features, right? And maybe the belief may work very well for justification of our actions. So there are cases in which it seems like our actions are not driven by beliefs after all, but are actually in contrast with our beliefs. Well, another case that I have recently explored in relation to anorexia nervosa, not all subjects affected by anorexia nervosa believe that they are overweight. But some of them can explicitly believe that they are underweight and still keep on in their harmful behavior.
Yeah. So I still think that I need to think more carefully about these cases and see if, in fact, I do need to go cheaper. And I'm happy to go like as cheap as people will allow. But I guess I think that these are cases where kind of one's emotional states kind of predominate, and those are cases that we can legitimately park as cases of not all else being equal. Because as you quite said, your belief that it's not convenient for me to have a dog, that will show up in the relevant ways if I, for example, kind of ask you calmly in a room without any puppies in it, like, is it convenient for you to have a dog? Then you will behave in the ways that we would expect. But of course, when I give you a puppy, you're the kind of person who is just going to be emotionally overwhelmed by that. And then we have a case of all else not being equal. So I wonder whether I can say that kind of thing about those kinds of cases, or whether it would just be better to go even cheaper. But on the going cheaper, I guess I wondered, how cheap can we go? Like, what is a belief? If I'm too expensive, then like, what is it? Or perhaps you don't have a view on that, but I was just curious.
Yeah, that's I think the problem, that is the metaphysical status of belief. Not very sure about that, but I don't think that one of the necessary conditions should be a causal relation to action.
Okay.
Should be not necessary. So I don't know how to. I'm also thinking about this problem, and I really like your approach. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
On
I'm
your
I'm
second
trying my
question,
way to go cheaper, you know, I'm trying my way to go cheaper.
I mean, yeah, good. I support you in your endeavours. On your second question about useful beliefs, and you said there are cases of false and harmful beliefs. I guess one of those cases are delusions. That would be an obvious case, and I do have a view on those. But in general, you might think that cases of beliefs which are false and are not produced by the second proper function, I think there are kind of two options that you have on the table at that point. You think that they're produced by mechanisms trying to produce a true belief and failing and getting a false belief instead. And then you can tell a story about whether that's because those mechanisms have malfunctioned,
Yeah.
or because those mechanisms are operating in conditions abnormal for proper functional performance. As it happens, I think, and you know, this is probably quite controversial. I think delusions are actually not malfunctions of belief. I think that they're better understood as mechanisms of belief trying to get a true belief, but operating in really terrible circumstances such that they're kind of prone to failing. Yeah, so I tell those kinds of stories about those cases.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please go ahead, Victoria.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering about the trio of religious beliefs, self-deceptive beliefs, and delusional beliefs, and why you had picked, you know, these three sets to focus on. Do you think that they've got something relevant in common? That's what one of the first question. The second one is about the strategy of focusing on the very specific form of Christian Christian belief, once a week Christians. Are you going to suggest that they're somehow representative, or how are they going to work in the project to support general claims about religious belief?
Okay. So thank you. So on the first point, religious, self-deceptive, and delusional, I guess I've chosen those three. So here's something that they all have in common. In a lot of the literature, particularly in the literature on non-dosasticism, they're all taken to be false. That's really uncontroversial in the self-deceptive and delusional case. It's obviously more controversial in the religion case, but that's the thing that they have in common. And these are all cases where there is a growing tradition of non-dosastic approaches. So there's kind of people that I can talk with about this. There are other cases that you might think about, so things like conspiracy beliefs, which I'm also interested in, although I haven't included. And I guess that's because the non-dosasticism for conspiracy beliefs is in its infancy. So Anna Aquino is a non-dosasticist about conspiratorial beliefs. But her arguments for that are not hugely dissimilar to her arguments on the religious belief stuff, which has more of a tradition. Another thing that people are non-dosasticists about is implicit bias. But the reason I don't include that is because I think they're right. I don't think implicit biases are beliefs, and so they don't belong in my book. I have a different view about implicit biases, and I talk about those elsewhere. On the Christianity question, so I suppose this is a slightly weasel way out, because I think that I'm not the one making non-dosastic claims about religious attitudes, and the people making those non-dosastic claims are basing their research on a particular religious sect, and I'm kind of just following their lead. My background thought is that, you know, we should take sincere avowals of belief across all religious faiths seriously, and unless we've got sufficient reason to think that people who are Muslim, people who are Buddhist, people who are Christian are getting it wrong, then we should take them seriously when they say, I believe that X. Van Leeuwen does talk in his book about how he is focused on this particular tradition, but how he thinks his view generalizes when certain conditions are met. And yeah, so I guess I'm just kind of following the lead of the people with whom I'm engaging. But my view about religious attitudes as beliefs, I think is going to generalize insofar as people in various traditions will sincerely avow that they believe particular things. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Any new hands? I could insert okay, you go, and then maybe I'll insert myself, and then we can come back around for second helpings. Go ahead, Oracle.
Thank you. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Could you hear me? Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful this seminar and your discussion. I'm really enjoy it. And
Thank you.
my question is, I noticed you use the term the modal space. So my question is about this term. If someone creates a fictional text, and could you think the textual space, I mean the word created by the writer, can be considered as a modal space? This is my first question. And my second question is about the belief and the memory picture scenario. If someone with Alzheimer disease and the person forgets everything without memory, do you think he or she still have the possibility to believe some things?
Oh, let me just check I've got that second question. This was a case where I was writing your first question down. This was a case where someone has severe amnesia, doesn't have a functioning memory, and you're asking whether they can nevertheless have beliefs.
Yeah.
Was that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. The first question is, which I think was, if somebody creates a fictional world, should we consider that a modal space? I don't know anything about fictional worlds. Here's my kind of hash thing to say about that. I think that the fictional world created by an author can teach us things about the modal space, so can teach us things about what's possible. And I think that a world created by an author, it would make sense. It would be coherent to me, it seems to me, that you could have a world where you've got creatures whose beliefs are formed not by kind of thinking about what's true, but by thinking about what makes them happy. And that seems to me to be a perfectly coherent world on which they have beliefs. And a kind of fictional world that properly thrashes that out might be able to teach us that that is indeed a coherent possible world. So I don't really know anything about fictional worlds. So that's my kind of thought about what you said. The amnesiac case is really interesting. I think I'm inclined to say yes, because I suppose even severe amnesiacs are still cognitive subjects who could represent the world in particular ways and have desires, and that's kind of all it takes. And once those representations are interacting with the desire in a way that kind of gets them to act, so amnesiacs can drink water and can kind of walk across a room, then that's going to be enough. But I might have missed the kind of a bit the sophistication of your question, but my immediate thought is yes, amnesiacs can have beliefs because they have the relevant psychology, notwithstanding the memory loss.
Okay, thank you. So I want to add something. This can be labeled as your age cases. I mean the second one. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, the amnesiac cases. I don't know actually, because I imagine that I think amnesiacs could have really straightforward beliefs, right? They could have beliefs about, they might not believe what their name is or where they were born, but they can have a belief that they're in a room, that they're lying on a bed, that there's water on the table. And they all look like kind of straightforward, boring beliefs to me, kind of produced by aiming at truth. So I wouldn't take the beliefs of amnesiacs necessarily to be edge cases.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question coming here.
Oh, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think I agree with the point that you consider belief is an attitude. Allow me to use an example. For example, if I say, I believe that my partner would pick me up today after work, it might involve some, I hope that he would come, or I trust that he would come. But my question is, in terms of the relationship between belief, desire, and emotion, because some philosophers would consider them as distinct ones, and also they have a correspondent different specific roles: cognitive, and affective. So if belief has a motivational role, do emotions and desires also motivate?
That's really nice. Yeah, I mean, you talked about hope and trust, and I don't have settled views on these, although some people do, and I think they're getting it roughly right. So things like hope, I hope that my partner picks me up. I think that those philosophers who say that this involves a cognitive and a cognitive component are getting things right. So I think that in order to hope something, you have to believe that it is at least possible. You have to have a non-zero credence in the proposition. But there's also something else, right? So hoping that P is not simply believing that P. So, and then you asked about the relationship between belief, desire, emotion. I'm not sure what to say about that, other than that I think those are separate things. And I mean, that might be an obvious thing to say, but I read a book last week called Belief as Emotion by Miriam McCormick, who she thinks beliefs just are emotions. So now the claim that belief is separate from emotion is actually an interesting and controversial claim, because at least some people think that's not true. So do I think that desires motivate? Yes, I suppose if I were a theorist of desire, then I would have to say a kind of something symmetrical. I would have to say that desires in concert with beliefs motivate action. I think I would need to say that. Maybe that's okay. I'm not sure I've quite got the kind of the crux of your question. Sorry.
I think you've already answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, fine, great.
Okay, maybe I'll add myself into the mix. My question is really in the spirit of Nevia's question at the beginning of the Q&A, trying to get at how cheap belief might be, though the example I wanted to work with was potentially somewhat different. I work predominantly on questions about self-knowledge, and occasionally you have to put forward theories about the natures of the kinds of attitudes that might be self-known. So inevitably you come into contact with different theories of belief in this literature. And the philosophers who come up with theories of belief in this literature have maybe kind of like impure motivations for how they draw their accounts some of the times, because there are these intuitions people have about a lot of our self-knowledge, like claims about privileged access and first-person authority and things of that nature. And so one way that philosophers go in the self-knowledge literature is they kind of bifurcate belief into two kinds, with the motivation of saying, there's this one kind to which we bear privileged access, and this other kind to which we don't, where we're just as fallible about ourselves as any outside observer would be about us, right? And this bifurcation, the beliefs on either side can go by different names, but the usual taxonomy would be to call one side our committed beliefs, and the other side are non-committed beliefs, or like our brute beliefs, or our merely dispositional beliefs, or whatever. And on the latter side, some people would say implicit biases count. I guess you registered that you don't think that, so maybe another time I'd be curious to learn more about your view there. I guess you've published on this, so I could go look at some of your existing work. But anyway, sorry, I'll hurry this along. On the committed side of the distinction, Akio Bilgrami is one person who has said that committed attitudes are like sort of fundamentally just normative, right? They don't necessarily have any motivational properties or any motivating properties. And that's because he thinks, committed attitudes or committed beliefs, I guess here would be the kinds of beliefs that you determine on the basis of your own judgment. You reason your way to them, or you see some sort of reason in their favor, and that's sufficient for you to committedly believe whatever that belief is. But he thinks you don't have to be disposed to do anything at all to live up to that commitment. So in such a case, we would say, look, there's a person who committedly believes that P, that belief has no motivational effect in their psychology. But according to him, the thing to do isn't to say, oh, this person doesn't have that belief. Rather, the thing to say in that case is, oh, they're just like maximally criticizable for failing to live up to that belief. I guess you would think that's just not a plausible conception of a kind of belief, but I'd be curious to hear if you have anything to say about why.
Well, so I don't know anything about self-knowledge. That's not a kind of personal claim about my own psychology. I mean, the kind of literature on self-knowledge. The kind of committed belief. So I don't like normativity in general. But if I've understood correctly, they're fundamentally normative, and they don't have motivational properties.
You
But
don't
they're
necessarily
nevertheless
have them, I should add. Yeah.
don't necessarily have them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's possible to have committed beliefs with no motivational component. Though one would hope at least many of our commitments involve some motivation, right? Because otherwise we're never acting from our commitments, and that seems bizarre, right?
But I suppose, and maybe this is a kind of artifact of me taking what the relevant motivation would need to look like to be pretty thin. But I don't really understand what a subject would have to look like for us to say they have a committed egalitarian belief or whatever, but that it has no motivational properties. Because at the very least, wouldn't we think that they are at the very least disposed to sincerely avow that P?
Yeah.
And if they don't even have that, then what's the sense in which I don't know why we would say that they have the belief.
Uh-huh.
But maybe that could be a failure of imagination on my part. Like I don't know what it would mean for them to have the belief, and I also don't know what, I mean, just in terms of kind of theoretically what we get from saying Ben has this egalitarian belief which doesn't have any motivational properties. On what grounds do we say that? Where does that get us in our theorizing?
Yeah, to put
So I
my
don't
cards
have
on the
anything to say.
table, I've always thought that part of Bill Gromy's view was super bizarre myself, and I've argued against it in certain places. I didn't want to register that in advance because I wanted to hear what you might think without,
What's
priming
the
you in
name
one
of the
direction or
person?
another. This is Akil Bill Gromy. He's at Columbia, I think. He talked about this a lot in a book called Self-Knowledge and Resentment.
Okay. Well, I should look at that because that looks like the most extreme kind of case.
Yeah, it might be the cheapest view about belief one could find, or maybe a version of the cheap view, not your version of it, but in that same space, I think Nevias.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
So I'm noting that the way Teams is configured, this call is going to shut down at exactly 7. So it's not one of those cases where we can run over a minute and not have it shut down. So maybe the thing to do is to call it here and at least give ourselves time to thank you with another round of applause for your talk before Teams kicks us all off the call. We need to reconfigure that setting in the future. Zoom doesn't do that to us. But,
No, Zoom is
yeah. So why don't we all come again together in thanking our speaker? Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's been super helpful. Thank you for your generous engagement.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll be in touch with you with a little debrief after this. Have a good morning, I guess, given.
Yeah, have a good evening, everybody.
Okay. Thanks
All
again.
right.
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Bye-bye.